Afternoon, Ben. Thanks for sending your slides through again. What have you got to tell us about today?
Super. Well, the theme of today is to plan for next year, basically, in two main aspects. So the first slide gives these two aspects. The first is those of you who have store lambs still not sold, you have to ask yourself the question, why are those tail end lambs still not sold? Now, for most of them, it will be things like worms, lameness, born late, had the worst of everything. But for some of them, they will be compromised by trace element deficiency. And the point of testing them is not so much for their sake, but to plan for next year so that you aren't in the same position or as bad a position this time next year. So we'll talk about that a little bit. And then the next thing is, how can you prepare for lambing time from the ewes point of view, from the point of view of providing enough energy to use? And now's the time to think about that if you haven't already. So to start with the store lambs, these tail end lambs are just struggling to finish, and people tell me that's been a big problem this year for one reason or another: bad grass, bad weather, all the usual things. There seem to be a lot of lambs hovering around the 30-35 kilo mark and not really getting over the line. So what might be the reason, and what can we do about it? Next slide says that most of it, I would have thought, will have been worms, although, as we said last week, the constant reinfection of worms will now have stopped. Other things that might be stopping lambs growing are the usual suspects of, on the next slide, the things you can't really completely avoid, like the abscesses and things they pick up, and the odd Pasteurella pneumonia, things like that. But all these things can be predisposed to by trace element deficiency, which I think the next slide explains. So the way to think about trace element deficiency is that lambs, when they're born, have a full tank of trace elements. I'm talking about copper, selenium and cobalt, because the transfer across the placenta from the dam to the lamb is quite good. So the tank is full when the lamb is born, and then the tank progressively empties, because the transfer across from milk is not nearly as good as it is across the placenta when the lamb's in the womb. So by this time, I think the next slide shows, the reserves will have probably run out, or will be in serious danger of running out, unless there's been some supplementation or thought given to the copper, cobalt and selenium situation, or at least that's likely. And that may be one of the contributory reasons why these lambs are still not sold and still looking poor. So now is the time to blood sample them, or to post-mortem one and take liver samples to assess their status. Not for their state so much, because you've already lost money on those, but for next year to plan at weaning or before, so that these lambs hit the ground running next year, so that you can supplement them before they get deficient, and hopefully they're gone by this time next year. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And the next question is, what do you do about that? And your options, you have a few options what to do for the lambs this time, and or what to do in advance of this time next year for the lambs next year. So bolus is probably the best, although you've got to bear in mind that the risk of bolus gun injuries. Injections, more and more injections becoming available. Those are probably the best two. The next best is probably blocks, and then field application is probably somewhere in between. But the point is, make the diagnosis now and plan for next year well in advance, so that you don't end up with lots of poor store lambs that have run out of trace elements for this time next year.
It does complicate the diagnosis a bit, though, doesn't it, when you've had some feeding and then not just been on grass and milk? But
it certainly does.
Definitely worth checking.
If it's normal, it might not have been normal before they were on the creep, but I have found situations where they've gone on to creep and they've still been low. Do you know what I mean? So if it's low, then it's definitely low, and it would have been lower before they went onto the creep. So even more reason to do something about it. That's the lambs. And then when it comes to the ewes, if you haven't analysed your silage, it's absolutely essential to analyse silage that you've made now, be it big bales, be it clamp, be it whatever. It doesn't matter if there are different big bales from different fields. Just make a call and do some of it so that it's representative, in order to ensure that the ewes have enough protein and enough energy in late gestation which is where the nutritional problems hit. And this is why. Because next slide shows you how big the rumen, how big the uterus gets in late gestation. That's the demand side of the equation, and how small the rumen gets. That's the supply side of the equation. So towards the end of gestation, of near birth, the uterus gets enormous and the rumen gets tiny. So the demand gets bigger and the supply gets smaller. That means there's a limit to how much a sheep can fit in its rumen. And that means it's essential that every mouthful contains as much metabolizable energy as it possibly can. And I've done the back of a fag packet maths in this next slide. Everything hinges on the ME of the silage that you've made. Here's the assumptions that I've made. The demand for a ewe in late gestation is something around 16.5 megajoules per day, but she can only eat 1.4 kilos of dry matter. And so the only other thing you don't know in that equation is the ME of the silage. If you assume an ME of silage of 10 megajoules times 1.4, you've got a deficit. If you assume an ME of 11, you've still got a deficit of 1.1. If you assume an ME of 12, you've got a surplus. So everything hinges on the ME. How much cake you may or may not have to feed, whether or not you have to feed cake at all, and how you manage these sheep and the risk of energy deficiency. So if you don't know the silage analysis, you really are in the dark. And now is the time to do it and plan long enough in advance. Those of you who don't feed silage and feed grass, you need to make some attempt to predict what the energy supply is going to be, because the energy demand, before you know it, is going to increase enormously. Every year you see people who get it wrong through lack of planning, and don't let it be you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Ben. Good info as always.